Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clouser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about a recent Washington appeals court ruling that gives lawmakers more cover to withhold internal records under legislative privilege. Uh, TJ, why don't you tell us what legislative privilege is, what changed, and why should residents even care about this?
Well, it really comes down to whether or not the public has access to the internal discussions of lawmakers about a bill before they go onto the chamber floor or during a public hearing. And so what happened is that the legislature tried to withhold records that were requested from media outlets like the Associated Press. They sued the Washington State Supreme Court in 2019, ruled that the legislature was subject to the Public Records Act. And so the legislature responded by using a provision in our state constitution to claim legislative privilege. And what this provision has to do with the fact that nothing that someone says on the floor of the Senate or House can be used, they can't be charged for a crime or a civil infraction. So they can pretty much say whatever they want and there's no legal consequences. And that argument is to protect their on their right to free speech. So they're applying that to internal discussions about emails or regard that, emails, memos, whatever. And so there was a group of people who brought a lawsuit against the legislature this second time around. And the courts have actually sided so far with the legislature, ruling that they do have legislative privilege and that they can redact or withhold records. And so the latest was the Court of Appeals that ruled in favor of the legislature. And it's possible it could go to the state Supreme Court, but we don't know yet. The plaintiffs would have to appeal it.
And why might residents want to see records like this, see internal legislative deliberations? What kind of insight would that give them into, say, the upcoming legislative session leading up to it? I mean, we're right at the end of it now, but what would that have allowed
I think
everyday residents to see?
I think one argument could be, the cynic could argue that the chamber floor discussions are just theater, political theater. It's people reading
Mhm.
prepared statements that they're going to put out. They've already got their press releases ready to send out. And so when they're being frank and truly, I don't want to use the word sincere, but it's where they're just speaking their mind is in these internal emails and communications. These internal records are where they're actually giving what they think, as opposed to going out onto the floor where you know, they're being recorded. It's being taken
Mhm.
down. They're not legally liable for what they say, but they do have to keep in mind that people are listening and what they say can be quoted, as opposed to internal discussions where they can say things where, I mean, imagine with the income tax where the lawmakers openly admit that they think it's illegal, but they don't care. That would
Mhm.
be like somebody who gets on the House or Senate floor and says, this tax is necessary, but in private they're saying, yeah, it's not necessary, but we want it anyways. I mean, so it would allow it would either force lawmakers to watch what they say in private, or it would give the public an understanding of what their lawmakers, their elected officials and representatives actually think.
Mhm. It's interesting to see, you spoke to it a little bit, the Senate and House floor being theater for these politicians where they might speak their minds but say things, different things behind closed doors, whether that be in person or in emails. I know the legislative privilege goes more towards the emails, but it would be interesting to hear what these people are saying in private with just each other because you see some pretty heated testimony on the House and Senate floor. And like you said, these are things that are recorded, they're clipped, they go on social media, and they go viral. But a lot of people don't know that some of these lawmakers live with each other in Olympia while they're in the legislative session. Not just Republicans with Republicans and Democrats with Democrats, but Democrats living with Republicans. Not to say that that's any sort of crazy idea or anything, but just the other day, the Senate had this resolution on the floor, and they were honoring Senator Judy Wardnick for all her time in the legislature before she retires, and Senator Noel Frame, which has pushed a lot of these progressive tax proposals. She spoke to her experience living with Senator Wardnick the last few years in Olympia and how they have had sort of heated discussions over certain legislation. For example, Catholic priests being mandatory reporters of child abuse. They said that they had pretty heated discussions on that. And I wonder what those discussions were like in their apartment in Olympia. Like, have they been talking about the income tax? Because those could be really interesting and pretty insightful for residents. And it's a conversation that we probably will never have eyes into unless they were to say, tap these lawmakers, which is never going to happen.
Yeah, I think it really it speaks to what is actually going on in government and how do things actually work. Because on paper, the debates occur on the House floor and the Senate floor. In practicality, the debates and discussions go on well before that. And
Mhm.
nobody goes to the House floor or Senate floor with with ambiguity about how either they're going to vote or how others like they always the caucuses count the votes. They know they don't bring a bill to the floor unless they know that they have the votes that are necessary, and so that means that they had discussions. What discussions were being had? Now, if it's verbal communication, that's obviously not subject to public disclosure. They're not walking around with audio recorders or they're I mean, their cell phones are, but that's a separate topic. But I think that yeah, I think it really raises the issue of to what extent does the public have a very accurate view of how lawmakers govern and how just the way of legislating actually occurs? Because yeah, if you've got two people with diametrically opposed politics living in the same residency together, it's not like they just drop politics when I don't know. I've never I I I have no idea what it is like to live with someone who you potentially have to badmouth during an election campaign, right? So, how that works out is something that, they might have to make a sitcom TV show about at some point. But, yeah, the issue is whether or not it actually, what's interesting is there was a constitutional amendment that was proposed that would have made these records subject to public disclosure, but just provide the same legal protections as when they're on the House, the House and Senate chamber floors, right? So the same legal protections. And what's interesting is it got read, but it got no public hearing. And so um, I think that it begs the question of why did it get no support? Is it because they just they don't see it as necessary, or because it's not about legally protecting them? It's about just the pub. We don't want the public to even know what's going on. I don't. That's the question that has to be asked.
And was that bill that you just brought up, it stalled, it's dead this session, but, who proposed that bill? Was it a Democrat bill, a
That was
Republican
a
bill? We know that
yeah.
Democrats have a near supermajority in the legislature.
Yeah, that was actually proposed by actually the Senate Local Government Committee Chair, Jesse Solomon. Then that was Senate Joint Resolution 8211. So yeah, it was two Democrats. So I think that there's been Democrats who've also, I think Jerry Paulette has also said that he's open to, he thinks this stuff should be subject to public disclosure. So this is not a partisan issue
Mhm.
down party lines. There's Democrats and Republicans who are in favor of it, and there's, those who are opposed to it. So I think that that will be interesting to what extent this court rulings, if the state Supreme Court sides with the plaintiffs ultimately, then is that how they're going to respond by passing or proposing a constitutional amendment? Because that's a pretty big hurdle. You got to get 2/3 of the legislature, you got to get 2/3 of the voters to support
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, I would like to hear the internal legislative deliberations behind that bill. I know that the bill stalled, but what were they saying behind closed doors, like, about that bill? Because it had bipartisan support, it sounds like, but interested to see if anyone was opposed to it. So this ruling that came out recently, is it do you think that it weakens the 2019 state ruling that said that lawmakers were subject to the PRA? What can I mean, that 2019 ruling said that they are subject to the Public Records Act. What do they have to disclose, and what don't they have to disclose based off this most recent ruling?
I think it's internal discussions about legislation. I think that that's the what it's subject to. Also, I would add, I mean, this is attorney-client privilege, but any communications that they have with their attorneys would also be, redacted or exempt from public disclosure because it's a client talking to their attorney about legal stuff. So, that's another exemption. So, does it undermine the 2019 ruling? I think that It weakens it because without this, we would get these records. If the legislature didn't claim this privilege, then we would be getting stuff that I think that because the thing is that if the 2019 ruling did exempt this stuff, the legislature wouldn't be using a new legal argument. They would be relying on the 2019 state Supreme Court ruling, which they're not. They're using a new legal argument because their prior one was you know, overturned by the high court.
Mhm. So you say that this could potentially go back to the Supreme Court, or this case. I know it was a separate case with the other one. When might that happen? Could there be a different appeal in a lower level back in the appellate court, or would the next step be the state
It's
Supreme
gotta be
Court?
this I imagine it would be the state Supreme Court because this has been there's Thurston County Superior Court that ruled in favor of the legislature. The Court of Appeals has ruled in favor of the legislature. I think the only option legally that they have left is go to the state Supreme Court. And so, uh, you know, we'll obviously be keeping an eye on this one because it obviously affects our work because these are records that we would in many cases we would want to get, but if this ruling is upheld, that we know we can't challenge it if they claim. I think the issue is no longer do they have legislative privilege. It becomes a fight over what constitutes what is it applied to the same way that the attorney general's office can claim attorney-client privilege with certain communications, but I've appealed some of those in the past. I've got some under appeal right now, and so that I think that that's gonna be the next fight if this is, upheld is where's the line drawn between legislative privilege and where it begins and ends.
Mhm. Well, we're right at the end of the 2026 legislative session. Uh, they just passed a potentially unconstitutional income tax that's bound for legal challenges. They're expecting future budget challenges in the years ahead. I mean, if this was opened up, I would be really interested to see coming out of this session what tax proposals they're talking about behind closed doors for the next session. But we'll have to keep our eyes on this case as it potentially reaches the state Supreme Court again. But CJ, thank you for covering this. And for anyone hoping to catch future coverage or this article, you can read it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.